Hello again. We're moving on to research methods number 6. This is very similar to the last one you did, but it's non-participant observation. Last time you did participant observation. This time we're doing the other side, non-participant observation. So let's get going. Now you should already be familiar with the two types because, like I said, we covered them last week. Participant observation, you actively join in with the group. You get involved with their day-to-day activities to really see the world through their eyes, to really get this feeling of Verstehen, German word, this kind of empathetic understanding, and get this really qualitative, really detailed, in-depth data. Non-participant observation, you're not joining in at all. You are simply a passive observer. You watch and you kind of make notes about the behavior that you see. Now this can be used to get both qualitative and quantitative data, but generally it's a bit better when you get the quantitative data, and I'll explain more about that when we get to the strengths and weaknesses. So actually I met my wife doing a non-participant observation. I was doing it at this train station, just watching the crowds. I was doing research about train control, and she walked past and I said, I've been waiting for this train for 20 minutes, but I've been waiting for you my whole life. And that's how I met my wife. Okay, again, there are two key terms here you should already be familiar with, you should already know. It's the difference between a covert observation and an overt observation. You could get specific questions on these, asking about the differences between covert and overt and the strengths and weaknesses that brings, so you need to be aware of them and you need to get it the right way around. Covert observations are done undercover. The participants are completely unaware, they don't know they're being researched. Okay, they don't know that they're being watched. And with non-participant observation, this can be done in a few different ways. So for example, you can use video cameras, hidden cameras, to covertly observe your participants. You could also use like a one-way mirror, like you see in the movies. That can be done and used so the participants don't know they're being watched, and you can observe them. Observe their behavior that way. Can't do that with participant observation, obviously, because they need to know you're there because you're joining in. But with non-participant observation, you can use these kind of bits of technology to help you do it. Overt observations are done in a completely open and obvious way. The participants know completely that they're being watched, being researched, and that's fine. Now, again, you could use technology to do that. You can use cameras, you can use the one-way mirrors. But you'd have to have told them that they are being watched in order for it to be an overt observation. And usually it is done with someone physically there watching people and in an obvious way. Right, we're going to dive right into the strengths and weaknesses here, going through the pervert factors. But one thing I'm going to mention before we start is that it's a really good idea, it's really good practice when you're writing about research methods to compare one method to another specifically. Like they come in pairs often. So like unstructured interviews, you compare to structured interviews. Laboratory experiments, you compare to field experiments. Non-participant observations, you'd compare to participant observations. And when you're talking about strengths and weaknesses, you say it is stronger than participant observation or weaker than, and explain why. Rather than just saying it's stronger on the whole, you're being specific and saying what it's better than in this area. So practically speaking, participant observation, non-participant observation is much easier, takes a lot less time, and obviously then when time's going into it, it's cheaper than participant observation. Okay, when you're doing a participant observation, you've got to do the getting in, the staying in, the getting out. There's a lot of issues. It can often take years. Non-participant observation's far simpler than that. I mean, you could literally just go to the high street and watch people. That's free. It's easy to get there, and you wouldn't be doing it for years and years. You could just do it for a few hours or a few days, and get plenty of data. So practically speaking, it's far better than participant observation is. Sorry. There are some limits to this. Practically speaking, if you wanted to do some research in certain places like schools or prisons, for example, it's going to be hard to gain access. Like a prison warden, the guy who runs the prison, isn't going to, they might not let you in, they might not give you access to observe the prisoners, and you're not going to be able to kind of force your way into a prison to do a non-participant observation or sneak your way into a prison. So you've got some issues there. It may be that access is restricted depending on what your research about and where it needs to be. The ethics of observations comes down to whether it's overt or covert. With overt observations, they know you're present, you can get informed consent, and there's no deception, you're not lying to anyone, it's all above board, and ethically speaking, then you're safe and everything's good. It's strong in that way. You compare that to a covert observation where they don't know they're being observed, they haven't got informed consent, and particularly depending on where you're doing it, you could be invading their privacy, and that's, ethically speaking, quite weak. That's a problem. But there is a trade-off. So overt observations, they're ethically strong, but because the participants know you're watching, that might lower the validity, and we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to validity. Whereas covert observations, the fact that they don't know you're watching, means you can potentially get an increased validity. One other thing to say as well is about observations, non-participant observations. You do them in a public space. You don't actually need informed consent. The idea is that when people go out in public, they expect to be observed by other people. You expect that other people will see you. You're not invisible. Therefore, like, informed consent is kind of implied there. You got consent because people expect to be seen out in public. Now, it's very different if you're using binoculars to stare into their house and things like that. That's an issue. That's unethical, and has all kinds of other issues with it too. But if they're in a public space, actually, ethically, you don't even need fully informed consent. The consent's kind of implied. So on the whole, if it's overt, it's ethical. If it's covert, it's lacking that ethics. Right, now reliability is a bit more of a complicated one in this situation because it depends on the way that the observation's done. It can be that non-participant observations are incredibly subjective. They involve a researcher's subjective interpretations of the thing that they're observing. So if I'm sitting observing students in the PAV, and I'm watching in the canteen or whatever, my interpretation of your behavior might be very, very different to another teacher or another student or somebody else. It can be very subjective. It's not like a fixed concrete thing. It can vary depending on how I interpret it. And that affects validity as well as reliability. It means that the research is very difficult to replicate and do it in the exact same way because you'll be looking for very different things. This is usually the case when the observation is trying to get qualitative data. Okay, now that's key. Non-participant observations are better in terms of reliability and validity when they focus on quantitative things, when they're looking for like statistics or numbers of times certain behaviors is observed. Because what you can do then is you can do something called operationalize. It's when you make the categories that you're looking for, the behavior you're looking for, so specific that it's very easy to measure. So for example, you'd sit down with any researcher or you would agree that you're going to look at violence and you're going to note down the number of times that someone punches someone else, which involves a closed fist hitting the other person. And so that's really specific, and that you can't subjectively interpret that in different ways. If someone punches someone, you know that that's what's happened and you can count that. And it means that somebody else doing my research can easily go away and do the exact same thing. They're looking for the number of times someone punched someone. And the other thing that can happen that makes it more reliable is if you're doing it in a quantitative way, again, looking for these numbers, statistics, and you've got more than one researcher, which often happens, more than one observer, you can all sit down and agree on exactly what you're going to count as violent behavior or loving behavior, or let's say you're doing a lesson observation of students of disruptive behavior off-task behavior. You can all standardize, key term, standardize the behavior into categories so that somebody else who wanted to do the research again has got a really easy job of saying, well, that's what we're looking for, that's clearly what it is, and this is what it's, this is not in that category and is in this category. So that all increases the reliability. You can also use video cameras, we said that at the start, using video cameras to help make the observation more reliable. This is because you can all watch, if somebody else wanted to do it, they can watch the exact same footage I've watched. They don't have to go out and find new footage. They can do if they want, but they can use the exact same footage. It's more reliable. It's done in the exact same way. Okay, time to think about validity. So how accurate the data is, how kind of true your research is. And again, it all comes down to how you're doing this observation, what type of observation you're doing. So we're still talking about non-participant observation. You're not joining in, you're simply watching. But if you do it overtly, if they know you're watching, there's a clear problem with the Hawthorne effect. Key term, Hawthorne effect. Again, you should know what this is, but people change their behavior when they know they're being watched. So you're not getting a true and accurate representation of how they behave, and that lowers the validity. Now, there's some things you can do to kind of reduce it a little bit, but there's still going to be a Hawthorne effect if you're doing the overt observation. So using cameras does mean that you're not physically in the room, and that might lower the change in people's behavior, but they're still not, they still know they're being watched because it's overt. They know they're being observed, they know there are cameras, so the chances are they're not going to behave in the same way that they would if it was covert. So alternatively, if you do a covert observation, validity goes up because there's no Hawthorne effect. They behave naturally, they behave how they would with, in everyday life, and so that's what we need. That's the kind of data we want. Problem there, though, the trade-off with that is it's less ethical. So there's informed consent issues, there's deception issues, which we've already talked about. You can sometimes improve the ethicality of it. So, like for example, in doing observations in college, it could be the case that we get parents' permission to observe you, and you don't know you're going to be observed, but the parents do, and they've given permission. That helps with the ethical side of it, but it's still unethical, or still less ethical than an overt. More valid, less ethical. Now, if you're doing a non-participant observation and your focus is on kind of qualitative data, you're looking for really kind of depth and detail and trying to get a lot of information about why people behave the way they do, because it's subjective, you might misunderstand the meaning behind people's behavior. Okay, it's very difficult to achieve Verstehen, this empathetic understanding, this being in their shoes, by just observing people. You can't ask questions, you can't get more information, you're not doing it yourself, it's not participant observation, you're not joining in, so it's quite difficult to really understand what's going through their brain. And so there's a weakness there, there's a limit there because it is subjective. You might not be getting the accurate understanding. If, though, you flip it around, you're searching for quantitative data, you're searching for very specific and measured and kind of numbers, statistics, statistical data, then it's likely to be more valid. You're likely to be able to accurately measure that, the number of times someone punches someone else, for example, because it's far less subjective. So now we're looking at the example bit of research for a non-participant observation, and this is really important because this is the background to the Hawthorne effect. This is why there's this kind of key term and idea called the Hawthorne effect. There was a sociologist called Mayo who was asked to go and do some research in a power plant called the Hawthorne plant in Chicago in America. And the whole point was he was supposed to be looking at ways that they can make workers more productive. So he observed workers in a range of different ways, changing the lighting, changing the temperatures, changing the amount of breaks or how long the breaks were, changed all of it. And sometimes he made it more comfortable to see what they did, and sometimes he made it less comfortable. And he wanted to see which one was going to kind of affect productivity, how well the people worked. And what he found was it didn't matter what he did, didn't matter whether he made it really comfortable, nice, or really unpleasant and harsh environment, no matter what he did, they were more productive. And so what he that's confusing. How does that happen? So what he concluded was the thing that was common throughout all of those kind of trials, all of those observations, was the presence of an observer. It was him. The fact that they knew they were being watched. So it didn't matter that they were hot, cold, sitting comfy in chairs, whether they were it was kind of dimmer lighting or really harsh lighting, or none of that mattered. What mattered was there was somebody there watching, and they knew that. And so that was when the Hawthorne effect was born. So you can use that to talk about support when you're talking about the Hawthorne effect. You can use that example to back that up. Let's look at the second R in pervert now. So we're looking at representativeness. How easy is it to, was the sample the participants used, was there a wide enough sample? Are they a true representation of the population? Can we generalize the results to the wider population? Now, non-participant observations, they don't tend to be very representative. It's very, very difficult to observe thousands of people at once. You could do 10, 15, 20, 50, maybe even up to 100, doing it in one observation, but you're not going to be able to observe thousands. Okay, so the representativeness is limited. Now, it's far better than participant observation. Okay, it's usually higher than participant observation, but on the whole, it's low compared to other methods. Now, there are ways that you can kind of improve the representativeness. So using cameras is a good way to do that. You can film everything that's going on in your, whatever your environment is, from multiple angles, and because it's recorded, you can go back and watch one person at a time effectively, and get through all of those people. And therefore it is more representative, and you could cover a much larger number of participants that way. But the trade-off there is you think about how much time that would take to observe each individual person on the screen. You think about a high street, think about people walking through the high street. If I was going to film a high street and then watch every individual person and their behavior, that's going to take an awful lot of time. So could be slightly more representative. Trade-off is the practical factor of time. Final factor in pervert is the theoretical perspective. Which sociologists are going to say this is a useful method, and which ones are going to say it's not, and why. Again, I'm going to do a whole kind of video on these two perspectives, and so it'll make a lot more sense. Once you've done that, you'll be able to go away and apply what you know about those perspectives to the different research methods. But here's a kind of introduction for you. Positivists are probably more likely to favor it, particularly when it's looking for quantitative data, when it's looking for statistics and the number of times certain behavior is observed. Because that's far more objective, far more scientific, and that approach is what the positivists want. And I'll explain why that is when we get to the future video. And when you compare it to like participant observation, which is very subjective, lots of interpretation there, there's a real preference for the non-participant observation from the positivists. Now, interpretivists, the other side of the argument, they're going to criticize that. They won't like the quantitative nature because you're not understanding, the full meanings behind the behavior. You're not understanding why people are doing what you're observing. Now, they might like it if you try and take a more qualitative approach, and you are trying to understand why, but it's limited. That's limited with a non-participant observation, because you can't ask questions and you can't kind of join in. Your Verstehen, or level of Verstehen, is going to be quite low. So positivists would prefer it. Interpretivists, they wouldn't really like it, even if it is trying to get qualitative data, because the Verstehen is limited. And hopefully that'll make a bit more sense when I've done the future video that you need. Okay, that's it for today. You're going to do the quiz. Make sure you bring your completed note sheet to the lesson. There's some complicated stuff there, so you need to make sure you're kind of pausing it, going over it, and coming back to it if you don't understand. Okay, thanks. I'll see you next time.